Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez lay motionless in the snow-covered ridge overlooking the Taliban compound, her breath forming tiny ice crystals on her rifle scope as she watched the SEAL team below move through what intelligence had promised was an abandoned village. But the thermal signatures dancing across her scope told a very different story, and as she counted at least 15 enemy fighters positioning themselves in the surrounding buildings, she realized the six-man team was walking directly into a carefully orchestrated ambush with no idea that death was waiting in every shadow. The wind howled across the Afghan mountainside, carrying with it the bitter cold that had already claimed feeling in her fingers, despite the specialized gloves designed for precision shooting, and Maria had been in position for over 6 hours since before dawn, when the stars still pierced the black sky like bullet holes in velvet. But now the pale winter sun cast long shadows across the valley, below creating a deadly maze of light and darkness where enemies could hide and strike without warning, and she knew that her elevated position 300 meters above the village was both her greatest advantage and potentially her final resting place. Through her high-powered scope, she could see the SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, making hand signals to his men as they approached the first cluster of mud brick buildings, their movements precise and coordinated like a deadly ballet performed in slow motion. But what Morrison could not see from his ground-level perspective was the network of tunnels and hidden positions that honeycombed the entire village, or the fact that at least 30 Taliban fighters had been waiting in those positions since the previous evening when intercepted communications had revealed the exact timing and route of the American operation. Maria adjusted her scope slightly to track a figure moving between buildings on the eastern edge of the compound, and felt her blood run cold as she recognized the distinctive profile of Ahmad Nazir, a high-value target who had been responsible for at least a dozen IED attacks against coalition forces over the past year, and whose presence here meant this was not just a random ambush, but a carefully planned trap designed to eliminate an entire SEAL team and send a message that would echo through every forward operating base in the region. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece as Morrison reported their position to base command, his voice calm and professional, despite the fact that he was leading his men into what Maria could now clearly see was a kill zone designed by someone with intimate knowledge of American tactics. And as she watched more thermal signatures appear on her scope, she realized that the enemy had positioned fighters not just in the obvious defensive positions, but also in locations specifically chosen to counter the standard SEAL team response. To contact, her finger found the safety on her rifle as she began calculating wind speed and distance to multiple potential targets. But the mathematics of long-range shooting in these conditions were complicated by factors that could mean the difference between saving lives and watching good men die, and she knew that once she fired her first shot, her position would be compromised, and she would become the primary target for every enemy fighter in the valley who had been trained to hunt American snipers. The SEAL team was now less than 50 meters from the central courtyard, where Maria could see the main body of Taliban fighters waiting in concealed positions, and she watched through her scope as Morrison raised his fist to signal a halt. But it was already too late because the enemy commander had been tracking their movement through his own optics and was already giving the signal for his men to open fire. Maria could see the muzzle flashes beginning to bloom like deadly flowers in the windows and doorways of the surrounding buildings, and she knew that in approximately 4 seconds, the first bullets would begin impacting around the SEAL team position, and that Morrison and his men would have perhaps 10 seconds to find adequate cover before the crossfire became so intense that movement would be impossible and extraction would become a recovery mission instead of a rescue operation. The wind gusted again, sending a spray of snow across her scope lens, and for a moment her view of the valley below became obscured. But as the white crystals cleared, she could see that the Taliban fighters were now moving into their final positions, and that several of them were carrying RPGs, which meant that even if the SEAL team found cover behind the stone walls of the courtyard, they would still be vulnerable to the devastating explosive rounds that could punch through almost any barrier. Her radio crackled again as Morrison began calling for immediate air support. But Maria knew that the nearest Apache helicopters were at least 15 minutes away, and that the weather conditions would make close air support extremely difficult, even if the aircraft could reach them in time. And as she watched the enemy fighters make their final preparations, she realized that 6 of America's most elite warriors were about to die unless she could find a way to disrupt the ambush before it reached its deadly crescendo. The Taliban commander raised his radio to his mouth, and Maria knew that he was about to give the final order to open fire, and that once that command was transmitted, the carefully coordinated ambush would unfold with mechanical precision, and the SEAL team below would find themselves caught in a crossfire from which there would be no escape. And as she settled her crosshairs on the distant figure, she felt the familiar calm that came over her in moments of extreme crisis, when time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. But even as she prepared to take the shot that might save 6 American lives, she could see movement in her peripheral vision and realized with growing dread that she was not the only sniper on the mountainside, and that somewhere in the rocks and snow around her position, an enemy marksman was also taking aim. The first shots erupted from 3 different buildings simultaneously as the SEAL team dove for cover behind a crumbling stone wall, but Maria could see through her scope that 2 more squads of Taliban fighters were already flanking their position from the north and south, while a heavy machine gun team was setting up on the roof directly above them, and as the team leader frantically called for extraction over the radio, Maria knew that in less than 60 seconds her fellow soldiers would be completely surrounded with nowhere to run, and the nearest backup was still 20 minutes away. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds echoed across the valley as muzzle flashes erupted from windows and doorways like a deadly light show, and Maria watched in horror as bullets began chipping away at the stone wall that provided the only protection for Morrison and his team, while the heavy machine gun on the rooftop opened fire with a sound like thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains themselves, and she could see chunks of ancient masonry exploding into dust clouds as the high-caliber rounds systematically destroyed their cover. Through her scope, Maria tracked the movement of the flanking squads as they used a network of irrigation ditches and low walls to approach the SEAL team position from both sides, and she realized that the enemy commander had studied American small unit tactics extensively because every route the SEAL team might use to escape was already covered by overlapping fields of fire, and the timing of the assault was designed to give the Americans just enough time to take cover before the trap snapped shut around them. Morrison was shouting orders to his men over the deafening gunfire, and Maria could see through her scope that Petty Officer Rodriguez had taken a round in the shoulder, but was still returning fire while Sergeant Williams was trying to establish communication with their quick reaction force. But the radio antenna on his backpack had been shattered by enemy fire, and their calls for help were disappearing into the static-filled void of the Afghan mountains. The Taliban fighters were advancing with disciplined fire and movement tactics that spoke of extensive training, and Maria realized with growing alarm that these were not the usual poorly equipped insurgents, but rather a specially trained unit that had been preparing for this exact scenario. And as she watched them coordinate their assault through hand signals and radio communications, she understood that the intelligence failure that had led the SEAL team into this trap was far more serious than anyone had imagined. Her radio crackled with desperate transmissions as Morrison reported their situation to base command. But Maria could hear the strain in his voice as he described their deteriorating tactical position, and she knew that even if air support could reach them in time, the close proximity of enemy fighters to the SEAL team position would make effective close air support nearly impossible without risking friendly fire casualties. The heavy machine gun on the rooftop had found its range and was now systematically destroying the stone wall that protected the Americans, and Maria could see through her scope that large sections of the barrier were beginning to collapse under the sustained fire, while the flanking squads had advanced to within 30 meters of the SEAL team position and were preparing to launch their final assault with grenades and automatic weapons. Maria shifted her aim to the machine gun team on the rooftop, but the angle was wrong, and the distance was at the extreme edge of her effective range, and she knew that even if she could make the shot, the muzzle flash from her rifle would immediately reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the valley, and she would become the primary target for concentrated fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Through her earpiece, she could hear Morrison coordinating the defense of their position, but his options were rapidly diminishing as enemy fire intensified, and she watched through her scope as Petty Officer Chen attempted to provide covering fire for Rodriguez, who was trying to reach a better position, but was forced back by a hail of bullets that sparked off the rocks around him. The Taliban commander was moving between positions, coordinating the assault, and Maria could see that he was wearing the distinctive vest of a senior military advisor, which meant he was likely a foreign fighter with extensive combat experience who had been sent specifically to plan and execute this ambush, and his presence explained the sophisticated tactics and coordination that had turned what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission into a potential massacre. Maria could see muzzle flashes erupting from at least 8 different positions now as more enemy fighters joined the assault, and the volume of fire directed at the SEAL team position was becoming overwhelming, and she realized that Morrison and his men had perhaps 2 minutes before their ammunition ran low, and their defensive fire slackened enough for the Taliban fighters to launch their final assault. The wind was picking up again, sending swirls of snow across the battlefield and reducing visibility, but Maria could still track the movement of the flanking squads through her thermal scope, and she watched with growing desperation as they reached positions where they could throw grenades over the stone wall and into the area where the SEAL team was trapped. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she tried to find a shot that would disrupt the enemy assault, but every potential target was either too well protected or too close to the American position, and she knew that a missed shot at this critical moment would not only waste precious ammunition, but would also reveal her position and eliminate any chance she might have to influence the outcome of the battle. The radio traffic was becoming increasingly frantic as Morrison reported that they were taking fire from multiple directions and that their ammunition was running dangerously low while the enemy assault showed no signs of slackening, and Maria realized that she was watching the final minutes of what might become one of the worst special operations disasters in recent military history unless she could find a way to turn the tide of battle with a single perfectly placed shot. Maria had identified the key target through her scope, a Taliban commander positioned in the central building who was coordinating the entire ambush through hand signals and radio commands, but the shot was nearly impossible at 800 meters through swirling snow and crosswinds, with the target only partially visible behind a concrete barrier. And she would have just one chance, because the moment she fired her muzzle flash would give away her position to every enemy fighter in the valley, and as she steadied her breathing and felt her heartbeat slow, she could hear the SEAL team below running dangerously low on ammunition. The commander moved again behind the concrete barrier, and Maria caught a glimpse of his profile through her scope as he raised his radio to coordinate what appeared to be the final phase of the assault. And she could see that he was wearing the distinctive insignia of a former Pakistani military officer, which explained the sophisticated tactics being employed against the SEAL team, and his presence here meant that this ambush had been planned at the highest levels of the Taliban command structure, with resources and intelligence that should not have been available to a typical insurgent cell. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear Morrison shouting orders to his men as their defensive perimeter continued to shrink under the relentless enemy fire, and she watched through her scope as Petty Officer Williams attempted to move to a better firing position, but was immediately pinned down by accurate sniper fire from somewhere in the eastern buildings, and she realized that the enemy had positioned at least 2 marksmen in overwatch positions, specifically to prevent the Americans from maneuvering. The wind was gusting unpredictably across the valley, creating swirling patterns of snow that would affect her bullet trajectory in ways that were impossible to calculate precisely. And Maria knew that at 800 meters, even a slight miscalculation would send her round wide of the target and alert every enemy fighter to her presence without accomplishing anything except ensuring her own death. And as she studied the wind patterns through her scope, she tried to find a moment when the air would be still enough for an accurate shot. The Taliban commander emerged from behind the concrete barrier again, and this time Maria could see that he was holding a radio in one hand and pointing with the other toward the SEAL team position while speaking rapidly into the device, and she realized that he was coordinating the final assault that would overwhelm the Americans through sheer weight of numbers and firepower, and that once he gave the order for the general advance, Morrison and his men would have perhaps 30 seconds before they were overrun. Maria adjusted her scope for the extreme range and began calculating the complex ballistics required for the shot, taking into account the altitude, the temperature, the humidity, and the unpredictable wind patterns that were swirling through the valley. But even with all her training and experience, she knew that this shot would require not just skill, but also an element of luck that she could not control. And as she settled into her firing position, she felt the familiar calm that, through her scope, she could see that the heavy machine gun team on the rooftop had shifted their fire to systematically destroy the remaining sections of the stone wall that protected the SEAL team, and chunks of masonry were exploding into dust clouds with each burst of fire, while the flanking squads had advanced to within 20 meters of the American position and were preparing to launch their assault with grenades and automatic weapons. The Taliban commander raised his radio again, and Maria could see his lips moving as he spoke into the device, and she knew that he was giving the final orders for the assault that would end with 6 dead Americans and a propaganda victory that would resonate throughout the insurgent networks of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as she placed her crosshairs on the small portion of his head that was visible above the concrete barrier, she began the breathing sequence that would steady her aim for the critical shot. Maria could hear Morrison over the radio reporting that they were down to their last magazines and that enemy fighters were visible in multiple positions, preparing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault, and his voice carried the controlled desperation of a professional soldier who understood that his tactical options had been exhausted, and that survival now depended on factors beyond his control. The wind died for a moment, and Maria felt the stillness in the air that every sniper learns to recognize as the perfect moment for a long-range shot. And she began the slow, steady trigger pull that would send a single bullet across 800 meters of hostile terrain to strike a target that was barely visible behind cover, while enemy fighters throughout the valley waited for the muzzle flash that would reveal her position. Through her scope, Maria could see the Taliban commander step slightly to his left to get a better view of the SEAL team position, and for the first time since the ambush began, she had a clear shot at his center mass. But the range was still extreme, and the target was small, and any number of factors could cause the bullet to miss by inches. And as she continued her trigger pull, she felt time slow to a crawl, as every detail of the battlefield became crystal clear. The SEAL team was now taking fire from at least 10 different positions, as more Taliban fighters joined the assault, and Maria could see through her scope that Rodriguez had been hit again and was bleeding heavily while Williams was trying to provide medical aid under fire. And she knew that even if her shot was successful, the Americans would still need to fight their way out of the kill zone against overwhelming odds. Maria could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips as she maintained steady. pressure on the trigger, and she watched through her scope as the Taliban commander raised his radio one final time to give what she knew would be the order for the general assault that would overwhelm the SEAL team position. And as the crosshairs settled on the center of his chest, she felt the familiar surprise as the rifle fired and the bullet began its journey across the valley. The recoil pushed her scope off target for a fraction of a second, but Maria quickly reacquired her sight picture and watched as the bullet traveled through the swirling snow toward its target, while below in the valley, the fate of 6 American warriors hung in the balance, and she knew that in the next few seconds she would discover whether her single shot had been accurate enough to save their lives or whether she had just revealed her position to every enemy fighter in the area without accomplishing anything except ensuring that 7 Americans would die instead of 6. The bullet left her rifle. At the exact moment, the Taliban commander raised his radio to his mouth, and Maria watched through her scope as the round traveled through the blizzard, struck the concrete barrier, and ricocheted at the perfect angle to find its target dropping. The commander instantly and within seconds, the coordinated ambush fell apart as confused fighters began retreating without leadership, while the SEAL team fought their way to the extraction point. But as Maria packed her rifle and prepared to move, she spotted movement in her peripheral vision and realized that one enemy sniper had been watching her the entire time and was now taking aim at her position. The Taliban commander crumpled behind the concrete barrier as Maria's bullet found its mark, and immediately the disciplined assault began to unravel as fighters throughout the valley lost coordination without their leader directing their movements. And she could see through her scope that the heavy machine gun team on the rooftop had stopped firing and was looking around in confusion while the flanking squads hesitated in their advance as they waited for orders that would never come. Morrison seized the moment of confusion and led his team in a fighting withdrawal toward the extraction point 200 meters to the south, but Maria could see that Rodriguez was badly wounded and would need assistance to make the journey while Williams was providing covering fire. With one of the few remaining magazines and the Taliban fighters were already beginning to reorganize under the leadership of a secondary commander who was trying to restore order to the chaotic battlefield. Through her scope, Maria tracked the movement of individual enemy fighters as they attempted to regroup, and she realized that while her shot had disrupted the coordinated assault, there were still more than 20 Taliban fighters in the valley who were now focused on preventing the SEAL team from reaching the extraction point, and several of them were moving to cut off the Americans' route of escape through a narrow canyon that provided the only viable path out of the kill zone. The muzzle flash from her rifle had revealed her position exactly as she had expected, and Maria could see enemy fighters pointing in her direction, while others began moving up the mountainside toward her concealed position, and she knew that she had perhaps 5 minutes before the first Taliban fighters reached her location, and that her elevated position, which had been an advantage during the long-range engagement, would become a trap if she remained there much longer. Maria began breaking down her rifle with practiced efficiency, while keeping one eye on her scope to monitor the situation below, and she could see that Morrison had managed to get his team moving, but they were still taking sporadic fire from multiple directions, and Rodriguez was slowing them down as he struggled to keep up despite his wounds, and she realized that the SEAL team would need additional support if they were going to make it to the extraction point alive. The secondary Taliban commander had established himself in the same building where his predecessor had died, and Maria could see through her scope that he was using hand signals to coordinate his fighters' movements as they attempted to intercept the retreating Americans, and she knew that this new leader was less experienced than the original commander, but was still dangerous enough to organize an effective pursuit that could trap the SEAL team in the narrow canyon. Maria shouldered her pack and began moving down the reverse slope of the ridge, using the terrain to mask her movement from the enemy fighters who were climbing toward her former position. But she could hear voices shouting in Pashto as they discovered the depression in the snow where she had been lying, and she knew that they would soon pick up her trail and begin tracking her across the mountainside. Through her handheld radio, Maria could hear Morrison coordinating with the extraction helicopter, which was still 10 minutes out, and fighting headwinds that were slowing its approach, while the SEAL team continued their fighting withdrawal through increasingly difficult terrain, and she could tell from the strain in Morrison's voice that Rodriguez was in serious condition and might not survive the journey to the landing zone. The Taliban. Fighters pursuing Maria were making good time up the mountainside, and she could hear them calling to each other as they followed her tracks through the snow, and she realized that they had brought at least one experienced tracker who was reading the signs of her passage with disturbing accuracy, and she would need to find a way to break contact before they closed the distance enough to bring her under effective fire. Maria reached a rocky outcropping that provided temporary concealment, and she paused to observe the valley below through her binoculars and could see that the SEAL team had made it halfway to the extraction point, but were now taking fire from a new group of Taliban fighters who had positioned themselves in the canyon mouth and were using the narrow terrain to their advantage by forcing the Americans to advance through a deadly funnel of crossfire. The extraction helicopter appeared on the horizon as a distant speck against the gray sky, but Maria could see that it was still several minutes away, and the SEAL team was running out of ammunition and options as they found themselves trapped between the pursuing fighters behind them and the blocking force ahead of them, and she realized that Morrison would have to make a desperate choice between trying to fight through the ambush or finding an alternative route that might take too long for Rodriguez to survive. Maria could hear her pursuers getting closer as they worked their way up the mountainside, and she knew that she would have to move soon or risk being surrounded, but as she prepared to continue her escape, she noticed movement in a cluster of rocks about 300 meters to her east, and realized with growing alarm that an enemy sniper had been positioned there specifically to cover her likely escape routes. The sniper was well concealed among the rocks, and Maria could barely make out the outline of his rifle barrel as he tracked her movement through his scope, and she understood that this had been planned as carefully as the ambush below, with multiple layers of security designed to ensure that no American forces could escape to report what had happened in the valley, and she was now facing a marksman who had been waiting patiently for her to reveal herself. Maria studied the terrain between her position and the enemy sniper and realized that there was no way to approach him without crossing open ground where she would be completely exposed and vulnerable. But she also knew that if she tried to continue her escape, he would have a clear shot at her as she moved down the mountainside, and her only option was to somehow neutralize him before he could engage her. The sound of gunfire from the valley below was intensifying as the SEAL team encountered the blocking force in the canyon, and Maria could hear the distinctive sound of RPG explosions echoing off the mountainsides, and she knew that Morrison and his men were facing their final crisis, and that the extraction helicopter would arrive to find either survivors or bodies depending on what happened in the next few minutes. Through her binoculars, Maria could see that the Taliban fighters in the canyon had positioned themselves expertly to maximize their advantage, and the SEAL team was pinned down behind inadequate cover while taking fire from multiple directions, and she realized that even if she could somehow deal with the sniper who was tracking her, she would still need to find a way to help the Americans break through the ambush before the helicopter arrived. The enemy sniper shifted positions slightly, and Maria caught a glimpse of his face through her binoculars and felt a chill of recognition as she realized that she was looking at Dmitry Volkov, a former Russian Spetsnaz operator who had been reported killed in Chechnya 3 years earlier, but had apparently survived and was now working as a mercenary trainer for Taliban forces, and his presence here meant that this entire operation had been planned and executed with professional military precision. Maria knew that Volkov was one of the most dangerous snipers in the world, with over 40 confirmed kills during his time in the Russian military, and that engaging him in a long-range duel would be suicide. But she also understood that he was the key to the entire Taliban operation, and that if she could somehow eliminate him, the enemy forces would lose their most experienced tactical advisor, and might abandon their positions. The voices of her pursuers were getting closer, and Maria could hear them spreading out as they approached her position, and she realized that she was now caught between multiple threats with limited ammunition. And no support while below in the valley, 6 American warriors were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and the success or failure of the entire mission now depended on decisions she would make in the next 60 seconds. Maria checked her rifle and confirmed that she had exactly 3 rounds remaining in her magazine, and she knew that she would have to make each shot count, because there would be no opportunity to reload once the shooting started. And as she studied the tactical situation, she began to formulate a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and more than a little luck to succeed. The extraction helicopter was now visible in the distance, and Maria could hear the distinctive sound of its rotors echoing across the valley, but she also knew that the pilot would not be able to land in a hot landing zone, and that the SEAL team would need to secure the area before the aircraft could safely extract them, and time was running out for everyone involved in this deadly game of survival on the frozen mountainside of Afghanistan.